Well, good evening, everybody. I think it's about time for us to begin. I want to begin by apologizing to the folks who stream with us that we didn't get on the air last week, and we apologize for that. We did not know it until we started getting calls from people, particularly my daughter and son-in-law wanted to know where we were. So I've been assured that we will be streaming tonight, and I'm grateful for that. I also wanted to call attention to two men who make this all possible for us. Russ Sturgeon is up in the booth taking care of sound and the streaming, and Steve Durham is in the back handling the camera, and we're grateful for both of them, because if they weren't doing that, we wouldn't be doing this in all likelihood. So I appreciate what they're doing. We continue to have problems with the coronavirus hitting our own people. We had mention of several folks on Sunday, and the Tillman family is now in. Scott and his mother have both been diagnosed with the coronavirus. They're not doing very badly. I talked to Michelle today, and so far their temperature has been fine, having some trouble with aches and pains, but breathing is still okay. But the rest of the family, of course, is quarantined. And I assured her we'd be praying for them, and I know you will too. But for all of our folks who've been hit with this, it's easy to watch the news and be concerned about what's happening across the nation or across the state or across the city. But what's happening right here gets even closer to home, and we're mindful of those people. So let's begin with our prayer tonight. Father, for another midweek class, we're grateful. We're thankful that the time has been set aside for us to focus a bit on your word. We ask that you guide us in doing that, that we learn from it, that we are strengthened by it. We are terribly moved by all that's going on around us with this pandemic. We are grateful for vaccines that are now being distributed and for the anticipation of more and more people being vaccinated against this terrible illness. We do pray for the folks of our own number, particularly those that we're close to, that we love. And we think of the Tillman family tonight and ask you, God, to bless and strengthen them. We pray that you'll be with each of us as we prepare for our worship this Sunday, and bless us in that assembly. In Christ's name, amen. Well, if you've read tonight's lesson, you notice that we've left out a big chunk. Not deliberately, we ran out of weeks. And when I planned these lessons, I have only 13 weeks to work with. And so with the account of Paul in the book of Acts, we could have gone on for 2 or 3 more weeks, but we didn't get to do that. So let me remind you that last week when we left off, Paul was leaving the elders, the Ephesian elders at Miletus. He was headed toward a ship. He was on his way to Jerusalem, was compelled to get there as soon as he could. We speculated last week that not only was he concerned about the funds that he was carrying, but also he was determined to be in Jerusalem in time for the Passover. Paul is a Christian, but he's also Jewish, and he's going to observe some of those Jewish traditions and continue with that. So we follow him as he leaves Miletus. He boards a ship bound for Phoenicia. He lands at Tyre eventually and stays there for about 7 days, and then goes on a little farther to Ptolemais, where he spent some time staying with a man named Philip. We learned later that Philip has 4 daughters and they're prophetesses. But this is the same Philip who was chosen way back in Jerusalem as one of those 7 men to take care of the Grecian widows. And it's the same Philip who converted or preached to and baptized the Ethiopian treasurer. So we're coming back to some people we've met earlier in the book, and they're appearing once more. And so Paul makes his way to Jerusalem. And we'll have a reference a little bit later about those funds he's carrying. And also he continues with his observance of the Passover. And while Luke doesn't explain it thoroughly for us, Paul made some kind of vow while he was in Jerusalem, a vow that required him to go to the temple to fulfill that vow. And he took along one of his companions, and some of the Jews became really stirred up. They thought he had brought a Gentile into the temple. They were just looking for anything to accuse Paul of. Luke says in this text, the Jews of Asia. And I wrote in my notes, those pesky Jews of Asia. They just keep popping up, creating problems, complaining, arguing, doing everything they can to try to undermine the work that Paul is going to do. While he's in Jerusalem, Luke tells us that he visited with the church, and he visited with James. This is James, the brother of Jesus, who we assume was an elder in the church at Jerusalem because of his leadership at the Jerusalem conference. So Paul checks in with some of the people that he needs to connect with, and then goes on about his business. But he's trying to pull all of this together, and in the meantime, all of those accusations that came from Jerusalem are now heading into greater trouble. And the people are stirred up. Again, Luke uses the word an uproar. The whole city of Jerusalem was up in arms. Paul first was sent to speak to the Sanhedrin. And he did something that I think suggests that Paul knew how to handle situations. He began to talk to the Sanhedrin about his belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Well, that was the wrong thing to say to the Sanhedrin, because they were pretty equally divided between the Pharisees, who accepted all of the Old Testament, and the Sadducees, who did not believe in a resurrection, anybody's resurrection. And so for Paul to assert the importance of the resurrection, the Sadducees rose up in horror. The Pharisees were trying to quell them, and great controversy broke out, so much so that they sent for some Roman soldiers. Come see if they can resolve all this problem. People were about to tear Paul apart, and a Roman commander named Claudius Lysias came in and took control of the matter and tried to resolve as much of it as he could. Paul finally asked to be allowed to speak to the people himself, and the crowd hushed enough for Paul to speak to them in Aramaic, in their own language, and began to explain what was happening. Well, Claudius decided he needed to be taken to Caesarea, which was really the capital of the Roman Empire in Judea at that point. Herod the Great had built much of Caesarea and named it for himself, Caesarea. And so Paul is taken there, and he is taken before a court there, a civil court. The folks who brought charges against him did not go to bear witness. And Paul complains about that the people who charged him, they should be here for me to face my accusers. They didn't go. But they sent two people. They sent Ananias, who was the high priest. This is the third Ananias in the book of Acts. You have to keep them straight. One was a villain, one helped Paul, and the third is the high priest. And they also sent a man named Tertullus, who's described as an orator. And Chad makes note in our lesson that that word could also be translated a lawyer, an advocate. He came to speak, to bring the charges against Paul. Didn't have the witnesses to testify, but just this man said, here's what happened. And so all of that precedes where our text starts tonight. And we're going to begin when Tertullus has finished his presentation. And now Herod turns to Paul and says, or Felix rather, turns to Paul and says, it's your turn to speak. Now, we've watched enough crime shows on television to understand something of how the whole court system works. Shirley and I just recently discovered on our TV one of those obscure stations that's not listed anywhere, but it's showing the old Perry Mason shows, and we're having more fun going to court again and watching Perry in action. So I understand what it means when you talk about the prosecutor and the defense attorney and so forth, except Paul is going to become his own defense attorney. And so he begins by saying, I want to answer for myself. And that means I don't need a lawyer, I don't need an orator, I don't need somebody to speak for me, I'll do it myself. And then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, inasmuch as I know that you've been here for many years a judge of this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself. Paul begins by commending Felix. Now, I haven't said anything about Felix yet. Felix is the Roman governor of Judea. He was not a very trustworthy man, and frankly was described as being unscrupulous. He had 3 wives. We find out in our lesson the third wife was a Jewish woman. Felix believed because he was governor, he could do anything he wanted to and he wouldn't violate any laws. He was above the law in his estimation. And so he proclaimed that he was free to do as he pleased. But in this case, he is at least ruling over the court. And he gives Paul his right to speak. Paul pays him a compliment. I know that you've been for many years a judge of this nation. He had been there living with the people. He understood their culture. He was more knowledgeable than some other folks might have been. And so Paul says, here's what he has to say. Because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship, and they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogue or in the city, nor can they prove the things of which they now accuse me. So Paul just presents, here's the beginning. I was only in Jerusalem 12 days. I couldn't have done nearly as much as they accused me of. Nobody heard me abusing anybody. Nobody heard me defiling the temple. I didn't do that there. I didn't do it in the synagogues. I didn't do it in the city. I haven't done any of the things that they've accused me of, and they don't have anybody here to present the case except this hired man. I'm paraphrasing, you understand. So Paul continues, but this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. So Paul begins by defending himself. I know that sometimes in our court situations, we say a man's a fool to try to defend himself. But Paul has the knowledge and the experience to do this. I will speak for myself. And then he says, while the things that they accused me of didn't happen, I will confess to one thing. I will confess that according to the way which they call the sect, I worship God. He recognizes these people are accusing him of being a Christian. They won't say that, but that's really what they're doing. Here we come back to that phrase that we've seen over and over in the book of Acts, the way, which becomes a means of describing the church. He also points out that some of the charges against him come from people who call the way simply a sect. It's just one of those small groups. They're a splinter group. They don't make any sense, that kind of thing. And we sometimes use that sort of approach to describe some group of people that we think are a little beyond the bounds. But Paul says, I will confess that I worship God and that I respect the law and the prophets. And for those folks who thought that he was trying to throw away all of Judaism, he said, I still believe in the law and the prophets. For those folks who thought he was trying to defile everything that was honored by the Jews, no, I worship God. I honor the law. I honor the prophets. All the things that are written there, those all are part of who I am. And so Paul's training has prepared him for such a time as this. It's not the first time he's been accused. It's not the first time he's had to defend himself. And so he does it here extremely well. He expresses next his desire to have a clear conscience. Up to this point, he hasn't done anything to defile his conscience. He feels totally free with what he's done, feels justified. And so he continues his defense at this point, starting in verse 15. I have hope in God. I worship God, but also have hope in God, which they themselves also accept. They have hope in God, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. Paul is determined to drive home the point of the resurrection. And the Pharisees believed in a resurrection. It's just the Sadducees who did not believe in it. They didn't believe in angels either, you remember. I do believe that there will be a resurrection, both of the just and the unjust. And you almost think of Jesus later dividing all of the people between sheep and goats, the just and the unjust. Or Jesus uses those same terms when he talks about God sending the rain on the just and the unjust, using the same words. This being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and man. Paul says, my determination is not to offend anybody, not to offend God. I want to have a clear conscience, a good conscience. And this always opens that door for, you mean I can trust my conscience? Well, to a sense, yes. When I know what I believe and what I am concerned about, I ought to be able to follow that. Then he adds this, now after many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation. There he admits, we brought some money here. This is the money that's been collected from other churches. This is really the only time that the money is mentioned in the book of Acts. Paul writes extensively about it in Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 2 Corinthians. And so it's from those three letters that we learn all that was going on about bringing the alms here. But he simply says, that's one of the reasons. I came to bring alms, the money that's been donated for the church at Jerusalem. And so that was his reason for being there, he says. In the midst of which some Jews from Asia, those pesky Jews, found me purified in the temple, fulfilling his vow that he had made. He was being purified, but neither with a mob nor with a tumult. It was just Paul and his companions. We didn't have a mob there. We didn't create a disturbance. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything to say against me. Here again is, where are my accusers? No one accused me? Where are they? Or else let those who are here themselves say if they found my wrongdoing in me while I stood before the council. Did I create a problem when I was standing before the Sanhedrin? I didn't do anything in the temple. What did I do before the council? Unless it is for this one statement which I cried out standing among them. Concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged by you this day. Paul said the only thing I said that stirred up any trouble was when I spoke about the resurrection. And that's what you're judging me for. The controversy was so great, such a disturbance among the members of the Sanhedrin, that the Roman officials had to be called in to quell it. And that's pretty bad. Typically, the Romans allowed the Jews to kind of take care of their own life. They didn't deal with it a whole lot. But here, Paul says, well, I did create that, and I said it loudly. Remember, Paul says later in 1 Corinthians, I determined to know nothing among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified. And then he follows up talking about the resurrection again. These are the basic fundamentals of your faith and mine. I don't have anything that's more basic than to believe in the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, the ascension of Jesus, the coming of the judgment. All of those things are so necessary for me. And so unless it's for that one statement, I don't know what the problem is all about. So we've gone through the early part of Paul's defense. He begins by praising Felix for what he thinks is appropriate. Incidentally, Paul's going to appear before three different rulers, Felix, Festus, and Agrippa. And we'll deal with those as we move along. So let's pick up with the rest of this text. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he adjourned the proceedings. See, Paul had said, you know more about this than some folks do, so he acknowledged, I have more accurate knowledge of the way. I've heard about it. I've talked to people. So he adjourns the proceedings. He stops it all and said, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will make a decision on your case. I'm going to wait for the commander to come. Well, at least he's going to take the word of the Roman official. The Roman official wrote a letter to Felix explaining what he perceived as the whole matter. So I want Lysias to come and let me hear him. And so we'll just put this off for a while. Well, that's all well and good, except he puts him off in prison. Now, he gives him more freedom than a normal prisoner would have, but he's still imprisoned. And Paul will write about that in those letters. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for him or visit him. Later, when Paul goes to Rome, when he appeals to Caesar at the very end of the book of Acts, he's allowed to live in his own house. People can come and go as they please. Well, he has a foretaste of that here in this incident in Caesarea. Felix says, give him some liberty. Let his friends come and go. They can provide for him. They can take care of him. No problem with that at all. Just give him a little freedom. And then Paul speaks to Felix. As he reasoned, I missed this first. After some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now you have to wonder why he decided he wanted his wife to hear Paul. Was it because he was Jew too? Could she explain some things to Felix that he didn't understand about the Jewish faith? Maybe. Or maybe Paul was just famous enough that he thought Drusilla would want to hear him. I've already said Drusilla's his third wife. Did he marry her just to give him more acceptance among the Jewish people because she was of the Jewish faith? Maybe. But they let Paul speak. It's interesting in this chapter, Paul does a lot of speaking. And he's given every opportunity, and he takes advantage of that opportunity. And so we have this very familiar text from Acts chapter 24. And as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I'll call for you." Well, we're more familiar with the old King James Version. Felix trembled and said, "Go your way. When I have a more convenient season, I will call for you." That's one of those passages that always fascinates us. Number one, how did Paul decide who he was going to preach on? What did he decide he was going to talk to them about? Well, they're pretty basic. Talks about righteousness. We assume he means the importance of righteousness, how to attain righteousness. Whom do we respect as being righteous? He talked about self-control. That's the kind of subject when people say you stop preaching and go into meddling. We don't want to be reminded of how important it is for us to exercise self-control. And then follows it up with judgment to come. Paul's already said that he believes that there is a judgment for the just and the unjust. So let's talk about judgment to come. That's a good three-point sermon. I've never preached it, but it's a good three-point sermon. Might be worth looking at sometime. And then here's Felix who says, "Well, I don't have time right now. Let's talk about this later." The kind of excuse that all of us have used under various circumstances, not just spiritual matters. We've done it with lots of things. Well, let's talk about that later. Or could we get together maybe next week and talk about that? Put it off. Where's that convenient season? In that familiar invitation song that we've sung so often, Almost Persuaded, the writer of that song has put together both Felix's comment and Agrippa's comment. It's Agrippa who says, "Almost you persuade me to be a Christian." But there is a line in that song that says, "Some convenient time." So both of those men get their responses caught up in a hymn. And we sing that while we need to think about these two incidents that happened that are so very important. So go away. We'll talk about this later. And then we find something about his lack of honor and integrity, because he was secretly hoping that somebody would come along and pay to get Paul out. You know, and keep him long enough. Maybe somebody would come along and say, "You know, you need to give that man his freedom. I'll give you X amount of dollars. I'll pay you. Just release him. Let him go." He also hoped that money would be given him by Paul himself, that he might release him, or somebody else. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. And you wonder what else they talked about in all those times. There is much, I think, to commend Felix for. He would like to hear Paul. He just doesn't always respond to it. Maybe it's one of those things where he just says, "He's a great speaker, and I love to hear him. I love to talk to him." But he hadn't affected me that much. But he liked to hear him. And then the passage concludes with one more verse. "But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix, and Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound." 2 years pass. Felix still waiting for a convenient time. And Festus comes in and finds he's got a prisoner that's been here for 2 years. Now, during those 2 years is likely the time that Paul wrote what we've come to call his prison epistles. And there are 3 or 4 of those that we classify as prison epistles, notably Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, So he gave him time to think about what was happening and to reflect on all of that. So what do we have from all of this? What do we conclude from it? Let me suggest some things that I think are worthwhile. One, accusations are made easily, but they're not always justified, nor are they rightly defended. It was easy for the Jews of Asia to make charges against Paul, but they couldn't defend them. They just made them and created a disturbance. We need to be sure that we haven't done that kind of thing with anybody. I think, secondly, Paul was a master of occasions. He knew how to handle each situation when he came along. He knew which button to push with the Sadducees, and he knew which topics would touch Felix. He knew exactly what subjects to bring up and how people would respond to those. We might say he was also brave to stand before the Sanhedrin and create that disturbance, and certainly to stand before Felix. 3, Paul did not avoid any opportunity to defend the cause of Christ. He's always going to speak positively about what he believes and what he's living by. And finally, Felix enjoyed his power. He could control, he could order about, he could even take advantage of somebody. And that easily happens with some people in power. Felix liked his power. And so we have this experience in Caesarea. And we move from here in our study to meeting with Festus and then with Agrippa. And that's when Paul makes his plea, I want to see Caesar. Back earlier when all that disturbance was going on in Jerusalem, and Paul was in conversation with the Roman centurion, Paul said, because they were going to order Paul beaten, Paul said, do you normally beat a Roman citizen? Oh, are you a Roman citizen? Yes. The centurion says, I had to buy my citizenship. Paul said, I was born a citizen. He's going to assert his right as a Roman citizen. He makes his appeal to Caesar, which is our lesson next week, and then we conclude with the shipwreck on the way to Rome. Thank you for being a part of us tonight. Appreciate it.